The story of how Eckhart Tolle got spiritually enlightened is really interesting, as it by itself tells us how to actually do it ourselves. Changing the paradigm of how we see things internally, we can also obtain the level of consciousness that every human being should have. He went through an overnight transformation. Eckhart Tolle was born on February 16, 1948, in Lunen, a small town in Germany. In his 20s, he moved to England and pursued studies at the University of London. And then he worked as a researcher and supervisor when he was awarded a scholarship in the Cambridge University. Everybody considered him successful, but on the inside, he was suffering from a very deep depression and continuous anxiety. He had been suffering from that for years, so he was actually miserably unhappy in spite of the fact that everybody else around him thought that he was a very successful person. Then a night came when he reached a super deep peak of depression. A thought kept recurring in his mind: I can't live with myself any longer. His pain, his dreadful unhappiness were too much to handle. He couldn't take it anymore. I can't live with myself any longer. That sentence became the trigger for his transformation. I cannot live with myself any longer. And suddenly he thought, what does this mean? Who is the I and who is the self that I cannot live with? There was a kind of separation that occurred at that moment. He separated himself, his sense of identity, separated from the unhappy, depressed, and anxious person. Suddenly, there was him there observing that unhappy self. So, there was a disidentification, and he thought, how is that possible? He can now observe the unhappiness as if it were in him but not essentially him. Then suddenly he became aware of what a peculiar thought it was. Am I one or two? He told himself. If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me, the I and the self that I cannot live with. Maybe only one of them is real. He was so impressed by this odd realization that his mind stopped. He was fully conscious, but there were no thoughts. Then he felt drawn into what seemed like a vortex of energy. It was a slow movement at first, and then accelerated. He was gripped by an intense fear, and his body started shaking. He heard the words "resist nothing," as if they were spoken in his chest. He felt like being sucked into an inner void, and suddenly there was no more fear, and he let himself fall into that void. When he woke up the next morning, he was in a state of very deep peace, and that lasted for several months, and it never really left him. But that deeply blissful state lasted for several months, and he didn't know what had happened to him. How is it possible that from one day, being a very anxious person, he could suddenly become transformed into a deeply peaceful person? Everything was fresh and pristine for him, as if it had just come into existence. He picked up things, a pencil, an empty bottle, marveling at the beauty and aliveness of it all. He realized that nothing could possibly add anything to what he already had. He knew, of course, that something profoundly significant had happened to him, but he didn't understand it at all. It wasn't until several years later, after he had read spiritual texts and spent time with spiritual teachers, that he realized that what everybody was looking for had already happened to him. What was it? It was the realization that the suffering is ultimately a fiction of the mind. He had created a mental fiction that he believed in and identified with as like every other human being. It was what he calls the ego, and through the pressure of suffering, he separated from that fiction. And when he separated from that fiction, it collapsed, as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy, because it ultimately wasn't real. What was left then was his true nature as the ever-present he is, consciousness in its pure state prior to identification with form. Later, he also learned to go into that inner timeless and deathless realm that he had originally perceived as a void and remained fully conscious. He dwelt into states of such undescribable bliss and sacredness that even the original experience he just described pales in comparison. A time came when, for a while, he was left with nothing on the physical plane. He had no relationships, no job, no home, no socially defined identity. He stopped studying for his doctorate and spent almost 2 years sitting on park benches in central London in a state of the most intense joy. He stayed with friends in Buddhist monasteries or sleeping anywhere outdoors. In 1995, Eckhart Tolle finally settled in Vancouver, Canada, where he began counseling individuals and teaching spiritual principles. Very often, people came to him wearing some kind of suffering, some form of pain. And what he tried to convey and teach is that it is possible to live free of suffering, to go beyond suffering. Instead of saying, I am angry, better say, I am experiencing anger. To say, I am upset or I am sick is like embedding that into yourself. So by saying there is anger in me or there is upset in me, you have already separated your essential identity from the emotional state. So you are no longer reinforcing the emotional state through your identification. He says, it's such a wonderful time in life when you suddenly realize that you don't have to be the victim of your thoughts, that you can shut those off just through the power of being in the now. But what is enlightenment? The word enlightenment essentially means a radical inner transformation. All the ancient religions recognize that there is something wrong with human beings despite the ingenuity of the human mind. There seems to be some essential flaw which causes humans to go into suffering, to create suffering and pain for themselves and for others. The solution to this begins with disidentifying from the thinking mind. This for some people may be a new thing because most people are totally identified with their thought process. So they are kind of trapped in their mind, and most people never or almost never experience a gap in the stream of mind. So the mind is like a river that pulls you along. And another way of describing it is to say that it's almost as if somebody had built a noise machine into your head. Imagine some demon builds a noise machine into your head and it doesn't have a switch off button. It's that constant inner dialogue that you feel that I can't quiet my mind. And the native cultures have a thing that is a trickster. A trickster keeps trying to trick you into these negative thinking patterns, and there are ways to quiet the mind and be still. Through meditation and attention to the present moment, you can start breaking the cycles of the mind and its restless train of thought. Eckhart Tolle gained widespread recognition with the publication of his first book, The Power of Now, A Guide to Spiritual Enlightenment, in 1997. The book became a bestseller and established Tolle as a prominent spiritual teacher. He continued to write and publish other influential works, including A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose. In 2008, Tolle was recognized by the New York Times as the most popular spiritual author in the USA. Tolle's teaching focused on the transformative power of living in the present moment and overcoming the egoic mind. He emphasizes the importance of mindfulness, inner stillness, and awakening to one's true nature. Eckhart Tolle has become a renowned spiritual leader conducting workshops and retreats worldwide, and his teachings have profoundly impacted individuals seeking spiritual growth and self-discovery. Thanks and subscribe.